Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Almost Awakened podcast. I am Teresa Hobbs, your solo host once again. And so I've been thinking about this episode for weeks. It's going to connect to the episode that I did on codependency in Mormonism about a month ago. Now, this is the opposite side of that, which is going to be Mormonism as a narcissistic system. So I'm going to cover how Mormonism mirrors narcissistic dynamics, why it breeds codependency, which again connected to that other episode, the impact on the nervous system when you are in a narcissistic system or whether that's a family system or a religious system. I'm going to cover the connection to chronic illness and chronic symptoms. I'm going to touch on Utah mental health stats and share a little bit about support and healing. So to start out with, Mormonism doesn't just resemble a narcissistic relationship, it structurally operates like one. And again, I've been thinking about this for a while. When you sort of take a perspective that's a little bit removed and you just start to sort of see how the system operates, you start to see these really interesting patterns. I went through a relationship where I had a partner who had high narcissistic traits, and after having experienced that and then learned more about mental health and healing and trauma patterns, I started to see those patterns really clearly in people. And then now sort of looking at the like high demand fundamentalist religions, especially the Mormon church, through that lens, you start to see some interesting things. So if you grew up inside the Mormon culture, there may be a reason why you felt like you were never quite enough, no matter how much you gave. And, it's not about individual members because I think there are so many incredible Mormons, right? But this is about how the system behaves. Because narcissism isn't just a personality trait, it is a relational pattern. And systems can embody that relational pattern just as powerfully as individuals can. So today I want to kind of slow down and really show you the mechanics of this. And you can let me know if you think that this is on point or not. I just find it really interesting. Because once you see this, you kind of can't unsee it. Okay, so I'm going to sort of go over like what is a narcissistic system. So most people think that narcissism means arrogance or grandiosity. And I like to pick on Trump because, he is the prime example of this. He whether you like Trump or hate Trump, whatever your feelings about him are, you cannot deny his narcissism. I mean, there's so much grandiosity there. He is just a prime example of this. But that definition of narcissism is kind of surface level. So at its core, narcissism is actually about protecting your image at all costs. It's about avoiding vulnerability, avoiding accountability, maintaining superiority, constantly controlling the narrative, blame shifting. A lot of narcissists will blame shift. And they require your admiration. And then if you dissent or let that person know that you disagree with them, they will punish that. So these are core sort of characteristics, and this goes way deeper. There's so many different types of narcissists, and we could go into all that and talk for days about that. But essentially, like narcissism is it's a protective response to feelings of inferiority, and so that kind of arrogance and grandiosity is sort of like covering that up. So a narcissistic person cannot tolerate being wrong because being wrong will threaten the identity. And they formed that identity to protect against that vulnerability. So again, they are people who tend to deflect. They will reframe, they will gaslight, they'll rewrite history, they'll demand your loyalty, and they will expect forgiveness without any repair. So if we zoom out, okay, what happens when an institution behaves this way? So then you get like a narcissistic system, right? So narcissistic systems are going to have predictable characteristics. And so we'll just feel into this a little bit, okay? So in narcissistic systems, the system is always right. Harm is individualized, it's never structural. Apologies are rare or carefully worded. They focus on image management, and they prioritize that over being transparent. Any dissent is framed as betrayal. And then loyalty is conflated with righteousness. So if you've ever been in a narcissistic family, you may already know that this dynamic, right? The parent in those family systems tends to be very fragile, and the children are expected to carry the shame of the parent. And I touched on this in the episode on codependency when I was sharing how, growing up, I learned that it was my job to protect against any male fragility. Like I couldn't allow a man to feel any sense of vulnerability. And so I had to sort of like absorb that and counterbalance that to make sure that men in my life never had to touch into that. And that wasn't a carryover from my family system that I grew up in. And also, I think now that I'm thinking about it, like, again, I grew up in a culture of Mormonism, and all of that sort of like gets passed down into the family system. So I want to now just sort of like overlay those ideas onto Mormonism. So the Mormon church presents itself as, the one true church, the restored gospel, the highest authority, and God's mouthpiece. That is a grandiose self concept. Now, what happens when in the church when historical problems surface? Do we see vulnerability, or do we see shifting narratives, careful PR statements? The church tends to put blame on imperfect people, right? They emphasize faith over facts, and then they shame the people who are struggling to make it all fit. So, institutionally, the church never says, hey, we were wrong, or yeah, we know we harm people, or we really need to repair this and fix it. Instead, what the church says is the church is perfect, but the people are imperfect. And that is deflection. So the system gets to remain pure, and the individuals have to absorb the flaws. And that is classic narcissistic positioning. So when policies cause harm, well, the narrative just becomes, hey, you misunderstood. You weren't faithful enough, or you're focusing on the negative, right? And when leaders are caught in deception, then essentially people get excommunicated, but that's beside the point. When leaders are caught in deception, the narrative there is that they were just speaking as men, or on the flip side, it's like when members leave, the narrative is, oh, hey, they were just offended, or they wanted to sin, or they were deceived, or they were lazy learners, whatever it is. So notice the pattern. The system never fundamentally admits its mistakes. It avoids institutional vulnerability. It avoids accountability. It reframes harm as opportunities for growth. And it expects followers to defend it at all costs. That is not humility. That, I think, is a narcissistic structure. So, now, one of the common threads in narcissistic relationships and dynamics is moving goalposts and setting unrealistic expectations. So, in narcissistic relationships, the expectations are impossible. You have to deny your needs and accommodate and present happiness at all times, or sacrifice without complaining, or stay in the relationship in spite of doubts that you are not allowed to voice. And also, you are expected to give everything without expecting reciprocity. Now, in Mormonism, you are expected to pay tithing before feeding your family. You are asked to serve endlessly, to attend meetings, to accept callings, all callings. You're not allowed to say no to callings, right? You're supposed to conform sexually, politically, culturally, theologically. And if you burn out, well, you just lack faith. If you happen to question any of that, then you lack humility. And if you struggle, well, then you just need to repent, because the goalposts are constantly shifting. Um, Now, when policies change, um, you're told that they never really changed in the first place. When language softens, the doctrine still stays rigid, right? So the members of the church are always expected to make the adjustments. It's never the church, it's always the members. And this keeps people in a constant state of self monitoring, self doubt, and self correction. Because if it's never the system, it's always the member of the system. It's always the member of the church that has to make those adjustments. And they can't ever place blame on the church itself or the system itself. So it has to come back to, to the self. And that's how narcissistic control works. When you're in a relational dynamic with a narcissist, it doesn't matter what you say, it doesn't matter what evidence you bring to the table. They will flip it around and make it about you, and somehow convince you that you were the one who made the mistake, or caused the friction, or whatever it is, or caused them to behave in a certain way that might have been negative. Now, I want to talk about why these patterns create codependency. And again, I covered this a little bit in that previous episode on codependency. Codependency thrives in narcissistic systems, and narcissists tend to be very attracted to codependence, and they also breed codependency because they need that other person to erase themselves in order for them to maintain their image, to maintain their identity. It's like there's almost like a kind of feeding off other people. There's a term I can't think of right now, but anyway, they always say like cut off supply. Like if you're working with a narcissist, the best thing you can do is cut off supply to them, because they literally thrive on feeding off of you and your sense of self to elevate their sense of self. So codependency tends to thrive in narcissistic systems because members are trained to prioritize the system over the self, to protect the image of leadership, to suppress any anger. And again, anger actually arises in us as a protective response that tells us that somebody's crossed our boundary. But in a narcissistic system, you are trained to completely subvert that, to suppress it, not to listen to it, and to allow the system to override your own boundaries. And the system also trains people to override their intuition, right? And to take responsibility for maintaining the harmony of the system, which happens in family systems or in relational dynamics with narcissistic people. That is a really hard word to say, by the way. So over time, you can learn. Over time, you can learn that belonging is conditional, that you have to perform in order to gain love, and that the only way to get safety is to be obedient. So your nervous system adapts to all of that, and by the way, again, not to criticize or bring any kind of negativity to people who grew up in Mormonism, but does anyone notice how much Mormons tend to fawn? And Mormons are also very tend to be overgivers. They learn to suppress. You become hyper responsible, and again, you disconnect from your authentic self. And I want people to know, like, this is not a personality flaw. This is the conditioning. And it can be really hard to see this. What makes narcissistic systems so powerful is that they train their members to defend them. And so you can feel incredibly protective of the system itself. You feel loyalty, and you feel guilt for even questioning. And it's interesting too, because the system itself, and again, I'm equating this to narcissistic dynamics, being in a parent-child relationship with a narcissist or being in a romantic relationship with a narcissist. They will ask you to give up your sense of self for them. And you tend to, and because they're constantly uplifting themselves and amplifying their own sense of identity as perfect and never making mistakes, you can idealize that person that you're in that dynamic with and almost get your sense of identity through them. And I feel like the church kind of does that too. It's kind of like, oh, well, I'm so proud to be a Mormon because it's the one true church. And my identity is linked with this system and its perfection. And I'm striving to be good enough within this system, but I gain my sense of identity through being attached to this system. So because of that, you can feel very protective. You can have a lot of loyalty. And any kind of questioning can feel like betrayal. And that is not an accident. That is structural. So again, narcissistic systems create dependency, just like narcissistic relational dynamics create codependency. And they can make leaving feel catastrophic because once you have created your sense of identity in connection to that person or that system, when you decide that you want to walk away, it feels like your entire sense of who you are has been ripped out from underneath you. You don't know anything. It's catastrophic. It feels horrible. It's very, very painful. And so that can keep people inside the system for a long, long time. Now, here's the part that I love talking about because it's my own experience. And this is where my expertise is. I want to talk about the body consequences. Because this is really important and it's so common. It's so much more common than people realize. So most people don't connect these dots. And I want to share how chronic nervous system activation isn't sustainable. Our nervous systems are supposed to move into activation and then deactivation. So we go through these different cycles of activation and deactivation, activation and deactivation. And if we don't get to that deactivation, we will sustain chronic activation, and that can show up through states of anxiety or feeling like we're always on or feeling stressed out or burned out, and those types of patterns, chronic nervous system activation, are driven when we are in systems that make us fear that we're always unworthy, or when we have fear of eternal consequences, or fear of losing community if we step out of alignment, or fear of disappointing God. The fear of eternal consequences was a big one for me because that permeated everything I did. It was like every action I took, I felt like there was a constant eternal consequence for that. And I didn't know how to fix that. There was so much pressure on trying to live right so that I could be okay in the next life. Because, Mormons teach you that basically this life is just a tiny little snippet. And then there's eternity, right? And everything depends on how you're living in this life. And that is so incredibly pressuring, And so that was always on my mind. And so that can keep your stress response activated and online all the time. You don't get to come through, you don't get to experience a deactivation cycle. And so, so you're constantly in that state of activation and high stress. And also in these systems, a lot of times anger and grief and fear aren't allowed. So they get suppressed and they go underground. And those emotions that go underground become physiological. And they can show up as chronic fatigue. They can show up as like CFS-ME type syndromes, hypersensitivities, where you have like chemical sensitivities or food sensitivities or like reactions to, allergies and stuff like that. You can have that kind of ties into mast cell activation syndrome. People can have long COVID, chronic pain syndromes, autoimmune disorders, anxiety disorders, and depression. It's interesting because Utah ranks near the top nationally for depression and suicide, according to organizations like the Mental Health of America and data from the Utah Department of Health and Human Services. And it's important to recognize that, obviously correlation isn't causation. But what I do know is that high demand religious environments create physiological pressure, and they don't give people autonomy. So pressure without autonomy creates dysregulation, and dysregulation over time becomes illness. These are not character flaws. They are physiological survival responses. And it can feel like your body's betraying you when suddenly you have all these symptoms that come up and you don't know what's causing them and you feel like you're falling apart. But your body isn't betraying you in these situations. It is literally just trying to communicate with you. And so for a lot of people, the body will become the place where all of that suppressed truth will finally get expressed. Because if you couldn't say no externally, your body will eventually say no internally. And I've shared this with a lot of clients who I work with, because a lot of people that have chronic illness or chronic symptoms like this tend to have a hard time saying no. And so their body will say no for them. So fatigue becomes their boundary, or pain becomes a kind of signal for them, or shutdown becomes protection. And it can feel devastating. For those of you who don't know my story, there's an episode on the Almost Awakened podcast where I share that fully, where I went through complete and total shutdown, became bedbound, had severe chronic illness and chronic symptoms. And I had to figure out how to work my way out of that. And it was a very long and tedious process. But it's why I'm here today. So if you were raised in a system that taught you to push through, or to sacrifice more, or have more faith, or serve harder, when your body stops cooperating because of all that pressure, it can feel like failure. But what if it isn't failure? What if it's actually an invitation? Now, it may not be the invitation that you asked for. It never is. And it may not be an invitation that feels fair, because it's not that either. But it is an invitation. It's an invitation to meet the parts of yourself that were never allowed to exist. So it's asking you to meet the fear, the anger, the grief, the confusion and betrayal, and the exhaustion of performing goodness. Healing from chronic illness or chronic symptoms in this context isn't just medical. It's actually relational. It's identity work. It's nervous system repair, and it's trauma healing. And I want people to really, really understand that healing is possible. I was at places in my experience that I couldn't believe the symptoms I was having, and I didn't think it was possible to ever come back from that. But I did. And not only did I heal from the chronic symptoms and the chronic illness patterns, but I healed in ways that gave me more capacity to live my life in a more authentic, meaningful way. And I look back on my experience with gratitude, because I never would have been able to meet those things had I not been stopped in my tracks and been forced to do it. So healing is absolutely possible. You can learn to restore safety in your body. You can develop self-trust, more capacity for joy. You can learn to have more emotional range, where you learn to be comfortable with emotions, comfortable with sensations in your body, comfortable managing and dealing with activation and what we call anxiety. And you can learn to develop more of an authentic identity. So a lot of people who start addressing things like this can see symptom improvement as a byproduct of nervous system healing. When the body no longer has to carry suppressed threat signals, it can finally shift out of chronic survival mode. And that kind of healing, it requires something that high demand systems will never teach you. And that is that you don't get to bypass the hard stuff. You get to go through it. And it's very confronting. It's hard. Again, we're told that we should suppress that, run away from it, not address it. But the way to heal is the way to get out of that is through, right? So we move through the grief, we move through the anger, we move through the identity loss and learn how to create a new authentic identity. We move through nervous system dysregulation into regulation. And we move through the terrifying process of learning how to trust ourselves. Sometimes for the first time. because a lot of us, I don't know, I'm trying to think of like, if you were at your youngest stages before you were told to disconnect from yourself, if we ever had that self-trust, I don't know. But so for a lot of people who were raised in Mormonism, it's learning to trust yourself for the first time. And on the other side of this whole process, again, people often discover something unexpected. It's not just symptom relief, but you can recognize a new sense of empowerment, of life satisfaction, of freedom, of play, and of joy that isn't based on performance. And you find this sense of self that isn't based on approval. So I want to share a little bit about how I help people, because this is work that I do every day. It is my life's calling. It's what I'm passionate about. So I love talking about it because I love seeing the changes in people's lives. So I work with people who have developed chronic symptoms after years of self suppression, religious trauma, chronic stress, trauma of all kinds, actually, who have typically codependency patterns, attachment disruption patterns, and a disconnection from their self. So these are people that typically are navigating chronic fatigue syndrome, or what's known as ME, long COVID. A lot of times people can have like mystery neurological symptoms that have never gotten diagnosed, or they have no diagnosis because they've run all these tests and everything comes back, normal. A lot of people that tend to have chronic pain or fibromyalgia, IBS situations and autoimmune conditions, and nervous system dysregulation. And essentially, if you've ever gotten a diagnosis that starts with functional in the beginning, that tends to be aligned with this mind body stuff. So when I work with people, I don't, it's not about forcing the body to behave. It's not about fixing things. It's about changing the relationship to your body. So I use approaches with people like nervous system regulation, pain reprocessing therapy, somatic awareness. I help people understand how to process emotions naturally. It's not something that you have to go seeking or searching for. I don't dive into trauma processing. I help people understand how to meet what's unwinding in their systems in the here and now. Um, I offer people a lot of education and help them understand how to practice trauma informed mindfulness, which is so powerful. I'm such a geek about mindfulness. I help people understand how to reconstruct identity, how to do boundary work, and how to bring and develop and build more self compassion. Um, and so through that process, I help people teach their nervous systems that it is safe to feel, and that it's safe to say no or yes, that it's safe to exist outside of performance, and how to actually identify and trust their own internal signals. And so as safety increases, a lot of people start to notice different shifts. So they can feel more energy, they can feel less symptom intensity, greater resilience, more emotional capacity, um, more capacity to deal with stress. Because I teach people how to complete stress responses, how to be with and process through stress activation, so that it discharges from the body and releases, and they can come back into greater states of regulation. And this also helps people to come into a deeper sense of aliveness. And it's not because their body, it's not because they were fighting with their bodies, right? That's the paradigm that we're taught, is that we have to fight with symptoms, that our symptoms are the enemy, our body is the enemy. And I teach people a new way of being, that their body is not the enemy, and you don't have to fight with it, and you don't have to fix it. It's more learning to be present with, and showing your system how it can process through all the activation and all the stored emotions that have been locked in your system, and not in a way that's really scary. I do this with people in a very titrated, gentle way, because this process doesn't have to be excruciating. It's not easy, and it is confronting, and we do have to learn to sit with discomfort and move through that, but we can do that in a gentle way. So I want to share a little bit about some groups that I'm going to be launching. I've created some upcoming groups called Anchor and Regulate that'll start March 11th. And these groups are designed for people that are navigating chronic symptoms, chronic pain conditions, chronic illness, or nervous system dysregulation from the lingering impact of either chronic stress or trauma. Now, they're not therapy groups, and they're not spaces, again, focused on fixing you. They are structured healing containers, I guess we could call them, where I'm going to be combining psychoeducation with somatic tools, teaching people about nervous system regulation practices, and they're going to offer a lot of space for supportive connection. So each of the group meetings is going to include, a small portion. So the meetings are going to be like 90 minutes long, and 30 minutes of that is going to be on me teaching psychoeducation and offering people these experiential practices. And then the rest of the hour is going to be held for Q&A. So people can ask me questions about their own personal experiences. There will be space for people to reflect and share about what they're going through. And so you're not just going to be learning concepts, you're going to be learning how to apply them inside your own body and life in practical ways. So the focus is on helping you to feel safer in your nervous system, to understand your symptoms through a mind-body lens, and to gradually build trust with yourself. Now, the groups are going to meet, again, for 90 minutes over every other week. So I think they're going to be on Wednesdays, and it's going to be every other Wednesday over a 10-month period. And the cost for the groups is $60 a month. And anyone who's signed up for my groups will also get a discounted rate for any additional private coaching sessions. I wanted to make these groups accessible for people because not everybody who's going through chronic illness, especially if you've lost the ability to work, which happened to me, you can't always afford one-on-one coaching. And so I wanted to offer something that was accessible for people. And so it's just going to be $60 a month, and it's going to cover a 10-month period to give people a container that helps them to slowly integrate new information and learn to practice that in between meetings that we have. If this is something that resonates with you, you can click on the link in the show notes to sign up. Now, if you take one thing from today's episode, I hope it will be this: you were never broken. Your system has only been adapting in its attempt to keep you safe. And sometimes the body's collapse or shut down, or sometimes I call them glitches, is not the end of the story. It can actually be the beginning of your return to yourself, which is such a beautiful thing. So I hope that you will keep that close to your heart, that you will understand that if you're going through difficult physiological symptoms in response to chronic stress or trauma, that sometimes that can be an invitation back home to yourself. I want to thank everyone for supporting the Almost Awakened podcast. It's so helpful if you can like the episode. I'd also like to invite people to subscribe to the new channel on YouTube at Almost Awakened Podcast so that we can bring these episodes to more people. Bill and I are trying to move the podcast from the Mormon Discussions channel to its own channel. So please subscribe to the new channel, and help us support this so we can get this out to more people. All right. Thank you so much for listening. Take care, everyone.
Thanks for tuning in to the Almost Awakened podcast. For more tools, resources, and real talk about conscious living, visit almostawakened.org. That's almostawakened.org, your resource for waking up